The Years Between Snowfalls. Chapter 1. When Thomas saw Evelyn sitting alone at the back of the church hall, his first instinct was to leave before she noticed him. 23 years was enough time for strangers to grow from almost anything, and yet one glimpse of her lowered head brought back entire seasons of his life with painful clarity. She looked up while he was still deciding. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and the small polite smile she gave him felt less like forgiveness than recognition of an old wound neither of them had managed to outlive. For a moment, neither of them moved. People drifted around the folding tables carrying paper cups and slices of pound cake wrapped in napkins. Someone near the kitchen laughed too loudly. A child ran past with a red balloon dragging behind him on a string. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary evening. Thomas stood near the entrance with his coat still on, unable to remember why he had agreed to come. Then Evelyn lifted one hand slightly, not quite a wave. It would have been cruel to pretend not to see her. He crossed the room slowly. The closer he came, the more the years rearranged themselves in strange ways. Her hair was shorter now, touched with gray near the temples. The sharpness of youth had softened from her face, but not disappeared. She still carried herself carefully, as though trying not to disturb the space around her. "Thomas," she said when he stopped beside the table. Her voice unsettled him more than her appearance had. Time had changed its texture but not its shape. "Evelyn." She nodded once. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't." A faint smile appeared, then vanished. "That sounds like you." He could not tell whether she meant it kindly. The chair across from her remained empty. After a hesitation he could feel in his chest. He sat down and placed his gloves beside the paper program in front of him. Printed across the top were the words Community Winter Fundraiser, though most people in town had shown up for reasons that had little to do with charity. In small towns, loneliness often disguised itself as civic duty. "You still live out near Bell Road?" she asked. "Yes. The old house." He nodded. "I thought you might have sold it by now." "So did I." That earned another brief smile, more genuine this time. It changed her face enough to remind him of a summer evening so distant, he almost doubted it had happened at all. Evelyn barefoot on the dock behind her parents' cabin, laughing because he had dropped an entire basket of fish back into the lake. The memory arrived cleanly and left just as fast. He looked down at the table. "How long have you been back?" 3 months. 3. I didn't tell many people." "No," he said quietly. "I suppose you didn't." The silence that followed was not hostile. That was the difficult part. Hostility would have been easier to carry after all this time. What sat between them now was gentler than anger and heavier than either of them wanted to admit. Across the hall, volunteers began stacking chairs near the stage. The event was ending. Outside the tall windows, snow moved steadily through the parking lot under the yellow streetlights. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her untouched coffee. "My mother passed in October," she said. Thomas looked up immediately. "I didn't know. It was quick." "I'm sorry." She nodded without answering. He remembered her mother vividly. Ruth Bennett had possessed the unsettling ability to look directly at a person while speaking as if she already knew the worst thing they had ever done. Thomas had once spent an entire Thanksgiving terrified she could somehow sense he intended to ask Evelyn to leave town with him after Christmas. He never got the chance. "You came back for her?" he asked. "At first." Evelyn glanced toward the windows. "Then it became harder to leave." Thomas understood that better than he wanted to. This town had a way of holding people still. Not happily. Not completely. Just enough to keep their lives circling the same streets long after they had promised themselves otherwise. "You still working at the school?" she asked. "Maintenance now. You used to hate fixing things." "I still do." That made her laugh softly, and for one dangerous second he forgot how to breathe properly. The sound carried him backward without permission. 23 years disappeared. He was 29 again, standing in her apartment kitchen while rain struck the windows hard enough to blur the town outside. Evelyn laughing at something he had said. Evelyn reaching for his wrist. Evelyn believing still that they had time. Thomas shifted in his chair. "You all right?" she asked. Fine. But he was no longer certain that was true. Someone called Evelyn's name from across the room. A woman near the stage lifted a coat from a chair and pointed toward the exit. Evelyn raised a finger in acknowledgement before turning back to him. I should probably help clean up. Thomas nodded immediately, relieved by the interruption and disappointed by it at the same time. She stood, slipping her gloves on slowly. It was good seeing you. Yes, he said. You too. Neither of them moved away. The pause lingered just long enough to become visible. Finally, Evelyn looked down at the paper cup in her hands. I heard about your wife, she said quietly. Thomas felt the air change around them. Most people in town avoided mentioning Claire directly, as though grief might spread through conversation if handled carelessly enough. It had been 4 years, but the silence surrounding her death still followed him into grocery stores and post offices and church parking lots. Thank you, he said after a moment. Evelyn nodded once. There was something restrained in her expression now. Not pity. Something more complicated than that. I wanted to come to the funeral, she said. I just didn't think I should. Thomas looked at her for a long moment without speaking. The strange thing was, he understood exactly what she meant. Across the hall, another stack of chairs scraped loudly against the floor. The child with the balloon had started crying somewhere near the entrance. Snow continued falling beyond the windows, steady and patient, covering the parking lot in quiet layers. Evelyn stepped back first. Well, she said softly, good night, Thomas. Good night. He watched her walk toward the stage without looking back. Only after she disappeared into the crowd did he realize he was gripping his gloves too tightly in one hand, as though he had been trying to hold onto something that had already slipped free once before. Chapter 2. Thomas drove home with the radio off and the heat turned too low. Snow gathered softly along the edges of the windshield while the road unwound ahead of him in pale ribbons beneath the headlights. The town looked smaller in winter. The empty storefronts, the darkened porches, mailboxes leaning slightly under the weight of old storms. He had spent most of his life here and still could not decide whether the place comforted him or simply refused to let him go. At the four-way stop near Mercer's Pharmacy, he caught himself thinking about Evelyn's hands around the coffee cup. Such a small detail to remember after 23 years. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. By the time he reached Bell Road, snow had covered the tire tracks leading up to his house. The porch light cast a weak yellow circle across the front steps. Claire had always complained the bulb needed replacing. Thomas had never changed it after she died. Inside, the house held the familiar silence of rooms lived in alone. He hung his coat carefully by the door and stood for a moment in the kitchen without moving. The clock above the stove ticked too loudly at night. He had noticed that only after becoming the only person there to hear it. On the counter sat a grocery list he'd written 3 days earlier. Bread, coffee, batteries, nothing urgent enough to remember. Thomas opened the refrigerator, stared inside without interest, then closed it again. He wasn't hungry. He was restless, which was worse. He moved toward the living room and stopped beside the bookshelf near the window. A framed photograph rested there between 2 old hardcover novels. Claire on the coast of Maine, hair blown across her face, smiling directly at the camera with visible impatience because he had taken too long to press the button. You look serious, she had told him afterward. You always say that. Because you always do. He picked up the frame now, more from habit than intention. Claire had been warm in ways he never fully learned how to answer. Even after 15 years of marriage, she could still surprise him with tenderness at moments he least expected it. A hand against his back while passing through the kitchen. Coffee waiting before he woke. Quiet understanding on the days he retreated into himself without explanation. He had loved her. The certainty of that remained intact. But standing there in the dim living room, snow tapping lightly against the windows, Thomas became aware of another truth moving underneath it. Something older. Something unfinished. He placed the photograph back carefully. At 9:30, the phone rang. The sound startled him enough that he let it ring twice before answering. Hello. A pause. Then, you still awake? Not a question. Evelyn's voice had always done that occasionally, turned uncertainty into quiet observation. Thomas sat down slowly on the edge of the sofa. Apparently, I almost didn't call. That makes two of us tonight. Another pause followed, softer this time. In the background, he could hear faint movement. A cabinet closing, running water, domestic sounds that unsettled him more than silence would have. I found something earlier, Evelyn said. After the fundraiser. What kind of something? She hesitated long enough for him to picture her deciding whether to continue. A letter. Thomas looked toward the dark window beside the couch. For a moment he said nothing at all. What letter? He asked finally, though part of him already knew. My mother kept boxes in the attic, Evelyn said quietly. I've been sorting through them for weeks. A breath. It was from you. The room around him seemed to narrow slightly. He leaned forward, elbows against his knees. I wrote a lot of letters back then. This one never reached me. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. Outside, wind moved against the side of the house with a low, hollow sound. When was it dated? He asked. December 98. He remembered immediately. Not the exact words, not the paper, but the feeling of sitting alone at the small kitchen table in his apartment while snow fell outside the windows. Writing carefully because too much depended on clarity. Telling Evelyn he would wait for her at the bus station Christmas morning if she still wanted to leave town together. He had waited 3 hours. She never came. I didn't know she had it, Evelyn said. Thomas swallowed once before speaking. Neither did I. The silence between them deepened. Not empty. Not comfortable. Full. My mother told me you changed your mind, Evelyn said at last. She said you left before sunrise. Thomas stared at the floorboards. No, he said quietly. I stayed. On the other end of the line, Evelyn stopped moving entirely. He could hear it. The stillness of someone suddenly afraid to make noise. She told me you were scared, Evelyn whispered. I was scared. That's not the same thing. No. Snow brushed softly against the windows. Thomas rubbed one hand slowly across his forehead. He felt tired in a way sleep could not fix. For a long time, Evelyn said, I thought leaving had simply mattered more to me than it did to you. He looked toward Claire's photograph across the room. I'm sorry, he said. The words sounded insufficient the moment they left him. Evelyn did not answer immediately. When my mother got sick, she said finally. She tried to tell me something twice. Her voice tightened slightly. I thought she was confused from the medication. Thomas waited. She asked if I still blamed you. He closed his eyes again. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Evelyn let out a small, uneven breath that almost became a laugh. Strange timing, she said softly. Finding that letter tonight of all nights. Thomas understood what she meant, though he did not believe in signs anymore. Life had cured him of that gently over the years. Still, something about the conversation felt less like coincidence than interruption. As though the past, having waited patiently long enough, had finally decided to speak for itself. What did the letter say? He asked. Evelyn was quiet. Then, I don't think I should read it over the phone. A subtle shift passed through him at those words. Not rejection. Possibility. He heard her move again in the background, pacing now perhaps, or standing near a sink with one hand against the counter the way she used to when thinking. I shouldn't have called this late, she said. I'm glad you did. Another silence. This one different. Careful. All right, Evelyn said quietly. Good night, Thomas. Good night. But after the line disconnected, he remained sitting there with the receiver still in his hand. The house felt altered somehow. Not larger, not smaller, simply less settled than it had that morning. Thomas eventually stood and crossed to the window. Snow continued falling over Bell Road in slow white currents beneath the porch light. Somewhere beyond the trees and dark rooftops, Evelyn was awake too, holding a letter that had arrived 23 years too late. And for the first time in years, Thomas found himself wondering whether a life could change direction long after it had already hardened into shape.